National Trust owns nearly 600,000 acres of moorland, mountain farms, nature reserves, bird sanctuaries, and 550 miles of coastline. It was these landscapes, these special open spaces, that the National Trust was founded to protect. And as we take you on a personal and privileged tour, we shall meet some of the dedicated staff who on our behalf look after this green and pleasant land. Britain's coastline is a hugely important part of our heritage. Its significance is strategic, economic, aesthetic, and spiritual. And yet we're in danger of loving it to death. So keen have we been to purchase a sea view that our coastline's been rapidly disappearing beneath a blanket of bungalows, car parks, and caravan sites. In 1965, the National Trust declared its most pressing objective the preservation of Britain's remaining unspoiled coastline. A national appeal called Enterprise Neptune was launched by the Duke of Edinburgh. And to date, £20 million has been donated and 545 miles of coastline permanently protected. For Enterprise Neptune to be successful and coastline to be safeguarded, land acquisition is the key. While the Trust has owned the headlands either side of the entrance to Salcombe in South Devon since the 1930s, it's less than 10 years since it bought its first land upriver, Snape's Point, an area that dominates the whole estuary. A beautiful estuary like this will always attract development, and perhaps it's surprising that the Trust's interest in acquiring estuary land is so new. The Trust depends on its own special sources to hear of land coming up for sale. As coastal warden for Salcombe, Alan Stone's local knowledge is invaluable to the regional land agent, John Longworth Craft. John and Alan constantly check on how the estuary is changing. There's increasing pressure from boats, and some landowners have been removing hedges.
Well, Alan, I think we've got to keep our eyes open for other land like this, haven't we? Because we can see how important this is in the context of the estuary. And also how some of the hedgerows are being lost in various places. So we've got an important role to play here, that's for sure. We don't just buy land for the sake of it. We really do look very carefully at what that land is doing for the landscape and for the area as a whole. In the estuary here, our principal aim is to try and acquire those areas of land which do contribute in a major way to the estuary and the appearance of the estuary. Snape's Point, where we're standing, is a prime example. I mean, it's a wonderful place. We can see that. It dominates the estuary, overlooks both up and down. But there are other areas which are perhaps rather more discreet, but where the importance lies perhaps in the nature conservation interests.
In charge of nature conservation at Blakeney Point in Norfolk is Joe Reed.
Blakeney Point is important for all sorts of different reasons, and there are several designations which reflect that. It's a site of special scientific interest. Last year it was declared a National Nature Reserve, which I think says something about the successful management of the property. We have 3 seasonal staff, and there's myself, and a lot of the work is I suppose really people management, is trying to maintain some sort of balance between the conservation interests of the site and all the recreational sorts of use that the site is subject to. So it's a full-time job trying to keep some sort of balance. That's the main thrust of the work, really.
Blakeney Point is summer home to 11 species of seabird, but one of its most impressive residents is the grey seal, Britain's largest mammal, living in a colony with the smaller common seal.
Probably the most popular wildlife that we have on here are the seals. They attract enormous numbers of people throughout the season, And again, we have to make sure that their own popularity, you know, isn't going to be responsible for their decline.
Grey seals from Blakeney Point have recently been monitored 300 miles away in the North Sea, off the Trust-owned Farne Islands in Northumbria. But most of the Farne's residents are birds.
Puffins and guillemots account for the vast majority of the birds on the Farne Islands. We have 70,000 pairs of seabird in total, of which 35,000 pairs are puffins. So that's half our total seabird population is puffin, which is a good job because, of course, a lot of the visitors don't know that much about other seabirds. They want to see a puffin, so it makes a lot of people's day. We have about 8,000 on staple, 9,000 on brownsman. But the real star of the show out here is certainly the guillemot. Of 16,000 pairs on the Farnes, very roughly 12,000 pairs nest on these two islands alone, and that's quite spectacular. They're the birds that almost look a bit like mini penguins, but they're not related at all. So they nest on the inaccessible sort of rock tops that you can see over in the direction there. The gulls that you're seeing flying around the kittiwakes. We've got about 6,000 pairs of kittiwakes on the islands. They're the most regular seabird species. It's a strange sort of environment to live in when the weather's bad. You've arrived today, the weather's very nice, and you've managed to get ashore onto the islands. In fact, you're the first people we've seen for 5 days now. And at that time it's very different, but you'd think it would be very strange to live out here in an environment like that where you don't see any people, but everyone who works out here has got the intention of making a career as a warden, so they're all very interested in the bird life and the surrounding wildlife.
In 676 AD, St. Cuthbert became one of the first hermits to live on the Farnes. And his power over the animals he found here is legendary, in particular the eider ducks, which he's said to have so tamed that they nested under the altar. To this day, eiders are known locally as cuddy ducks.
We have about 1,500 pairs of eider ducks nest on the Farne Islands. On this island, Inner Farne, we have it's about 1,000 pairs of ducks breeding purely on this island. It's an incredible sight. You can walk around the pathways, the visitors come onto the islands, and we have eider ducks literally right next to the paths. When we monitor them, we can walk up to the eiders, slide our hands underneath, roll the ducks out of the way, and you can count the number of eggs, pop them back down. It doesn't seem to bother them too much. If you have a love of sort of the wildlife, I've been interested in sort of birds and things since I was about this big. Absolutely incredible. There is nowhere else, literally in the British Isles, where you can get so close to so many breeding seabirds. It's a fabulous experience for myself and the other people who work here. It's absolutely wonderful. If you can get the opportunity to sort of portray some of that enthusiasm across to the visiting public, it's even better. Wonderful place.
The wide range of natural habitats and wildlife reserves owned by the National Trust are an obvious source of education and fun for tomorrow's conservationists. Wycombe Fen in Cambridgeshire has a full-time warden who deals only with young people.
Right, well, different soils react differently to movements, and you can actually test for that. You can always rely on the girls. Right, jump, come on, come on, jump, 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 jump. Right, okay, off. Now, I could just about feel that, but it was nowhere near shaking like a jelly. Right, Willie, jump, 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 jump. Boys, stand still. Right, now, what do you think that was in the score of 1 to 10?
The main purpose of Wycombe Fen is to teach children about the environment in the environment. They absolutely love it, and in fact it's their energy that devises the programmes that we do. She was so silly, Elspeth. You're forgetting, aren't you? She was so silly.
When children's author Beatrix Potter bought Hilltop Farm in 1905, she fell in love with the Lake District and became the greatest of all trust benefactors in the lakes. Anyone who's read her classic stories will recognise the garden as it appears in her most famous books.
We've managed to keep the garden as it was in those days, even down to the fact that our gardener is instructed to leave it rather unkempt as you see it now. He has a list of approved weeds, and this is actually a deliberate policy to keep it looking as it did in, say, for example, the Tale of Tom Kitten.
In perfect sympathy with the aims of the newly founded National Trust, started by her friend Canon Rawnsley in 1895, she realised that her land purchases could preserve her beloved landscape in perpetuity. In total, Beatrix Potter left 4,000 acres in the lakes to the National Trust when she died in 1943. Today, the Trust owns 87 farms in the lakes. Protection is aimed at maintaining the delicate balance between man and nature. Early this century, when the National Trust made its first land acquisition in the lakes, the threat was already there.
Brandle Park on the edge of Derwentwater was purchased in 1902 by the infant National Trust in those days because it was perceived at the beginning of this century, even this area was under threat of development. It was considered worth putting a railway through from the Keswick area right the way down Borrowdale to extract stone from the Honister quarries. And therefore our founder members put together an appeal, in fact the first Lake District appeal, and they managed to raise the sum of £6,500 in a very short period, in 6 months, which ensured the purchase and therefore the safety of this land forevermore.
The most popular things we own by a long chalk are our gardens. Whenever we do a survey of members' views about the National Trust, they always say that the gardens are the things they love most. There are the famous landscape gardens, man-made pieces of classical landscape for which England is so famous, and Stourhead is the most famous of those. It's not what most people think of as a garden. There are no flowers in it, really. There are shrubs, but it's mostly water and temples and follies and bridges and trees. If you want to study what was known as the picturesque movement, you go to Scotland. And as you walk down from the Tay through the garden, you get a series of picturesque views, all very carefully composed. Nobody's ever heard of Biddulph Grange Garden in Staffordshire. It's a garden designed in the 1860s by a man called James Bateman, who was, like a lot of English people, a great traveller and very interested in plants. And his conceit was that this garden should recreate the habitats from which all the plants came from all over the world. In an extraordinary way, you walk through a cleft in the rocks and suddenly you come into China with a red and white and blue temple with golden bells on it glimmering across a lake. And a great bull with a golden sun in his horns glaring down at you. Most marvellous place. If I were going to recommend anyone to visit an autumn garden in England, I would go to Sheffield Park. The Nisses, I think, is the tree that colours so beautifully, makes a great display of flame which puts New England to shame. You don't have to know about flowers to enjoy sitting in a garden. So whoever you are, you can get pleasure from a place like Fenton House. It's loved by the people of Hampstead as a green oasis on the top of a hill with wonderful air like today in the middle of a densely populated part of the world.
I've a shelter for the hens and the stable for the ass, and sure what could a man want more?
The gardener, who you're going to meet, I think, is a very keen vegetable grower, John, and what you see down there at the end of the orchard is his own private garden. Of course, he's very happy for people to see it and will tell you all about what's growing.
I'm living all alone and there's no one looking after me. I remember one day there was a crowd of schoolboys came in, and most of them were up in the top garden, but two of the more adventurous chaps came down into the kitchen garden, and it was autumn time, and the apples were ripening and the tomatoes were reddening and the spuds were being dug up, and the two little boys who looked round in amazement, and the onions were swelling on top of the ground. One says to the other, "It's just like a supermarket here, isn't it?" And they shouted for the rest of the boys, "Come down quick, it's like a supermarket here." And I mean to go and ask her whenever I get bold if she'll come and have an eye to me. I don't know.
The National Trust now owns and preserves an example of almost every period and style of gardening. And some of them are famous throughout the world.
Barrington Court in Somerset, once home to the Lyles of Tate & Lyle Sugar, originally had a garden designed by Gertrude Jekyll, which replaced the farmyard. However, it's the Trust's biggest maintained kitchen garden, a 1-acre walled organic site, that attracts Cheryl Fountain.
I'm painting here because it's quite unusual, I think, to have a kitchen garden. I've not painted gourds and different sorts of beans before, and the raspberries are going to be an interesting problem. So I'm enjoying it very much, doing these different leaf textures and shapes. Spatially it's very interesting too, because there are the archways leading through to the doorways in a distant view.
Sailing off the Devon coast, east of Dartmouth in the early 1920s, Sir Rupert D'Oyley Carte, whose family fortune was founded on Gilbert and Sullivan operas and the Savoy Hotel in London, saw a little bay, which seemed to be the perfect place for a house and garden. It was called Colton Fishacre. The balmy microclimate was ideal for tender plants, and by the time the D'Oyley Cartes sold it, in 1947, the garden was magnificent. But by 1982, when the National Trust bought the Colton estate, principally for its coastline, the house and garden were badly run down. The house could be let once it was restored, but the only solution for the garden was to open it to the public and put it in the hands of a healing gardener with energy and initiative. David Mason got the job.
This garden, Julian, is an important feature in the garden at this time of year. Commonly known as the real garden or the walled garden, but the actual garden itself was a rose garden.
This was a rose garden?
For Lady Dorothy D'Oyley Carte.
David kept the original planting in most of the garden, but helped by the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew and other plant collectors, he introduced rare Australasian plants,
This is all new planting here, is it?
Basically, yeah. There was a few shrubs in here when I first came.
He's created a collection of shrubs and trees that thrive in Devon's exceptionally mild climate.
And we've planted it up basically on what we would call a Marquise style of planting, which is a Mediterranean style of planting. But in amongst the Mediterranean plants, I put a lot of Australasian plants simply because they enjoy very similar conditions.
Have you got any real rarities here? Anything
we've got some pretty unusual plants that are doing extremely well. There's a plant here which is a Banksia marginata. We have some Leptospermums, Lanigerum, which was part of the seed collection from Roy Lancaster when he was in the Antipodes a few years ago. Hakeas are also Australasian, and the plant just over there with the white flowers on is one of the Australian mint bushes, and that actually came from Kew. They realised it was a relatively important plant and they wanted it better distributed.
Is this a nationally important collection?
It's become an important collection.
The range of plants is what makes Colton special. David reckons there are 400 or 500 species in the garden's 20 acres. And he's added over 1,000 plants to the Trust's woody plant catalogue. This lists all the major trees and shrubs at 22 Trust gardens. And since they all go on computer, it's a unique record of our gardening heritage and another less public aspect of the Trust's work. Across the close from Salisbury Cathedral in Wiltshire is Mompesson House, one of the most beautiful Queen Anne houses in the country. Built in 1701 for the MP for Old Sarum. At the back there's a delightful half-acre garden, not based on contemporary designs since none survive, but laid out by artist Barbara Townsend, a previous owner. One of the smaller Trust gardens, it's quite simply a gem. Although at 74, May Griffin is the oldest gardener the Trust employs, she's a tireless worker, thinking nothing of shinning up ladders to prune the climbers, provided her colleague, Karen Rudd, who manages the house, holds the ladder steady. In such a small property, the garden is really an extension of the house.
May has looked after this garden single-handedly for 17 years. She comes in 1 day a week, officially, and it is May's garden. This beautiful garden is May's garden.
I usually make a list the night before of all the jobs that I know must be done. And then when I get here, I find that a rose needs tying up or something should be done. And so you're doing extra jobs, and you just keep going, and you try and work from the moment you arrive until 12 o'clock when the house opens to get a nice lot of work done then, because naturally you must, if visitors want to know the name of a plant or to talk to you in some way about the garden, well, you must give them a little time. I started wearing my moon suit about 2-3 years ago. It was issued by the Trust because they are very, very strict. You must spray before 12 o'clock before the house opens. You mustn't spray while the visitors are going round.
At Alfriston Clergy House Garden in Sussex, Nick Jarvis is replanting to reflect its 500-year history.
Americans find it hard to believe that this house was actually here 150 years or so before America was discovered. What I'm trying to do is get as close as possible to perhaps a medieval monastery garden as befits the house. This is most useful for taking away the smells of everyday life. Can you imagine no plumbing, animals living in the same house as you, actually in the same room as you, smoke from the fire all over the room and then gradually dissipating further and further into the roof and out of the roof. And possibly the birds nesting in the roof as well, dropping what they do best on the floor.
when I first came, that these beds were actually full up with hybrid tea roses, and the first job to do was take all the soil out, all the roses out, and replace them with good old-fashioned, lovely scented roses. Parsley, the Romans brought over. Figs came with the Romans. Thyme grows naturally on the downs. This is borage. They taste of cucumber. And a nifty little trick is to put one in an ice cube and let it melt, dissolve nicely into your pims. These are bear's breeches, and they were the inspiration for the Greek and architects and the Corinthians as the acanthus leaf motif on all their columns and over the top of arches and things like that. This is great mullein, Aaron's rod. They virtually resemble the shape of a foot, so they used to put them in the sandals to cure all sorts of foot problems, bunions, odour eaters, and also the equivalent of Nike's soft pads on those hard Roman roads.
You must really love your job, you know.
Yeah, it is, it's great. I mean, it is, it's just, I mean, you can't call it a job. I mean, honestly, you'd say, you know, I'd do that for nothing.
The National Trust has a reputation for the dedication and skill of its gardeners and its countryside managers. The whole of the Purbeck area in Dorset, which includes Dancing Ledge and Studland Bay, is the responsibility of Jeff Han. Seacombe Valley is an area of natural limestone grassland down the coast from Dancing Ledge.
I run a fairly large estate, and with other pressures we've got on the coastline, especially at Studland, sometimes your batteries need regenerating. And this is a place where I can come, sit for half an hour, peace and tranquility, watch the animals, and then go back with batteries fully charged.
It's one of the few places where the early spider orchid can be found. The Trust won't use chemicals in such a place, so a way has to be found to prevent the pervasive Brachypodium grass from smothering orchids and other wildflowers.
So we started off with sheep, they didn't eat it. Then we introduced cattle, and we had problems with graziers because it is poor land, and when farmers put their animals on poor land and their animals don't do very well, then they look at a financial loss, so they say, oh well, we're not doing it. So what we then ended up with is, I had the idea of putting ponies on it. So we introduced some Exmoor ponies, which are actually a rare breed, and there's only about 200 breeding mares in the world. It's quite nice of you lot. You'd run away if I wasn't near this Land Rover, wouldn't you? Hello then. What we're running is a wild herd, and if I walk in amongst them, or we walk to them, then they think they're being chased and they'll walk away, because they are wild, none of them are tame. But when we go in the Land Rover, they seem to not worry about the Land Rover, and I can get quite close to them. One or two of them will actually eat out my hand. I don't encourage it, but now and again we give them a titbit, just to make sure that I can get close to them, to the Land Rover, because we need to inspect them regular, because we want to make sure that they are healthy, and the only way to do it is actually to do it close up in the Land Rover. Will you lot move out of the way, we'll go on up. We're not looking for anything special, we're looking for just a mowing machine on legs. And with the youngsters, we're actually moving them on to other National Trust properties, doing the grazing, doing very similar grazing than what we're doing here.
In parts of the coastline, the National Trust depends on conservation work carried out by its tenant farmers.
The estate we have here is around about 300 acres, of which half is National Trust and the rest is owner-occupied. The main problem we get is associated with dogs and the damage that is done to sheep and occasionally cattle, and that has become a major problem for us. If you look at the situation of the public open space, it's an extremely natural area, and obviously the intention is to keep it natural. That's the main atmosphere that we try to create working with National Trust. The sheep are absolutely crucial to maintaining this environment, to maintain the flora, to keep the vegetation down, and their part in it is vital. Without the sheep, this would become totally overgrown. It is absolutely crucial that we maintain these areas with the sheep. About 3 years ago, on a cliff just across the bay there, we had a sheep that went about 30 or 40 feet down the cliffside and was stuck on a ledge. I rang out my friends in the Coast Guards and they came out with all the equipment. And they said, well, it's your sheep, you might as well go down and rescue it. So I strapped into the harness and I went down above the sheep. But I could see it was so nervous that if I came above it, it would jump off. So I went down round the side of it and came up from below it. The ledge was perhaps 8 feet wide, and as I came up underneath it, the sheep, in an extremely nervous situation, decided it would jump. So I caught the sheep in my arms and was there swinging in mid-air with 120 pounds of struggling sheep in my arms. Fortunately, I managed to swing back into the cliff, and we managed to retrieve it to the top of the cliff. It raced away totally unharmed. But certainly the adrenaline was running on a day like that.
Good wildlife management is a crucial part of the Trust's work, and as new farm tenancies become available, farmers wanting to lease Trust land must be prepared to meet stringent criteria. This is Chington Farm in East Sussex.
We've been farming here now for a year under the National Trust. All the arable land that we've had has had to go into the environmentally sensitive area, which restrictions on that include that we're not allowed to put any fertiliser on and no sprays over the period that the environmentally sensitive area is down for, which is 10 years. The fact that we can't put any fertiliser on and so we can't stock it as tightly as perhaps one could doesn't really worry me too much because we have the reduced rent, so it swings and roundabouts, as they say.
In return for a reduced rent, 29-year-old Paul and his brother Tom agreed to organically farm the Trust's 288 acres here.
When the tenancy came up a year ago, we applied for it knowing what it would be like. We knew the restrictions before we applied for it. And we survived the first year, which is going to be the hardest one. And the National Trust have obviously given us the opportunity to farm, which has been our lifetime ambition. It's very hard to get into farming, especially at our age, to have the opportunity. So we're very, very pleased.
We do have to abide by existing agreements, some of which date back 40 or 50 years in some cases. But the opportunity comes when you have a change of tenant or a new acquisition such as Chington Farm. If it was ever the case that the National Trust didn't pay enough attention to nature conservation, I think that's definitely not so now. And over the last 10 years, for example, we have paid increasing attention to the preservation and conservation of our wildlife. And with every new tenancy agreement that we enter into on our farmland now, we have conservation clauses which are negotiated and agreed with the farm tenant.
For the remainder of their lease, in order to fulfil their obligations to the Trust, and its hope to benefit wildlife, the brothers will return to traditional pasture, all the arable land currently sown with wheat and rape. This is the Honeycutt estate at Exmoor in Somerset, one of the biggest donations ever made by a private individual. Countryside manager here is Nigel Hester.
The estate came to the National Trust in 1944 and was given to us by Sir Richard Ackland, and he gave this together with the Killerton estate in Devon. This estate is about 12,500 acres, but the two together form the largest gift that the Trust has ever had. An estate such as Honeycutt has a large amount of upland area, and any National Trust property that has upland areas within it suffers from erosion generally. Dunkery stands at 1,705 feet, but is rapidly shrinking. It's probably 1,704 feet next year. We suspect we get about 500,000 visitors up to the point every year. The problem with Exmoor, the underlying rock is sandstone, and that wears rather rapidly, not just from the pressure of feet, human feet and horses, but also from rainfall. Camping on National Trust property is generally forbidden. We do have problems on the moor, people illegally camping, but luckily on the estate we have one farm that was changed many years ago into a caravan site, which sounds slightly unusual for the Trust. Normally you think of the Trust getting rid of caravan sites. It has a number of residential vans painted green to blend in with the trees and vegetation, but it allows touring vans and tents as well, and it provides very useful service because it means we can control the camping on the estate.
The National Trust's concern to preserve our environment goes beyond landscapes and caravan sites to entire villages.
I grew up not far from this one, Laycock in Wiltshire. With its shops and pubs and farms and its famous abbey, it's almost entirely owned by the Trust, a very difficult responsibility to discharge. The aim of the Trust is to conserve the physical structure, the streets and the houses of Laycock, much as they were in the 18th century, while at the same time allowing the village to function as a living, working community. Now, sometimes those two aims are not easily compatible. Although it's undeniably a very pretty, well-kept village, there is a rather unreal quality about it. Arriving in Laycock is a bit like walking onto a film set, or perhaps into a commercial for a well-known brand of bread.
Jean Sheard and her daughter Debbie beat off fierce opposition from 60 other people to secure this bakery business in Laycock.
My grandmother was a baker, and I'd made lots of bread at home. I didn't know all about it, but I did all my sums and put in a business plan to the National Trust. No, and here we are today, 3 years afterwards. We're still here, and we're still enjoying it, which is a big thing, I think, in business as well. The downsides are that I can't always do what I want to do in the village with the business. I would dearly love to have 1 or 2 tables in the shop and offer teas and coffees. I can't do that. I feel sometimes that my hands are tied. It isn't easy to keep a business running in the winter time in Laycock, so we look for other things. We make animal breads, teddy bears, hedgehogs, turtles and tortoises. We don't make the same ones every day. We've done some tortoises this morning. When they're baking, they swell up. You put currants in for the eyes beforehand, and whilst they're baking, the eyes shoot out, so you've got to put them in again afterwards.
Trust rules and regulations govern not only the siting of tea tables, but just about every exterior detail of every home. If you've chosen to live in Laycock as a tenant of the National Trust, you will have accepted that you do not choose what colour to paint your front door, or what tiles to put on your roof, even the number of flower baskets you hang outside. All these decisions are made according to National Trust rules of good taste. Residents claimed that exteriors are kept spick and span at the expense of interior repairs. The Trust believes its first duty is to keep the village as far as possible as it was in the 18th century, without, of course, the mud and the dung heaps and other things offensive to 20th century tourists. As regional land agent, David Riddle is responsible for maintaining the strict ban on intrusions like TV aerials, satellite dishes and double yellow lines. He also has a big say in choosing the tenants for all the cottages and farms around Laycock. How does David Riddle balance his adherence to trust policy against his responsibility to the tenants?
Well, I say our first objective is to preserve the village as a traditional village. Our second objective is to preserve the community within the village, as part of the village, and really to minimise where we can any conflict between the tourists that come, the visitors that come, and the people that live here.
Don't you sometimes feel a bit like Big Brother wagging your finger and saying you can't do this and you can't do that?
There is an element of that, yes, but I think people like what that policy is achieving and accept that it's a necessary part of trying to keep this village in its traditional manner. In terms of the choice of tenants, it's true that with the school in the village, it's an important part of the village, and we're very keen to keep that going. So there is a tendency to try and encourage younger families, particularly with children.
In the distant past, most of the inhabitants of Laycock were tenants of the great abbey and paid their rent in corn, hides and fleeces. From the foundation of the abbey in the 13th century, the poor were drawn to its doors to collect charity from the Augustinian nuns. The abbey was the focus of local life, and in a very different way, it still is. Now it's the central attraction on the Laycock tourist trail. Before the trust took over the abbey and the estate, it all belonged to the aunt of Anthony and Janet Burnett Brown. They still live here as tenants, and their home is part of the Laycock tour.
Well, it's not a museum. It is a lived-in house. Well, you'll get used to visitors, and indeed, at the end of the season, when they suddenly stop, the house feels rather empty, and you rattle about in it. But it is much more peaceful then.
Is there no disadvantage in living in a house that's open to the public?
Oh, yes. There are all sorts of restrictions. You can't just walk about in your dressing gown if you want to do that.
What do people most like, most appreciate about the house?
Some people, I think, expected something a bit grander and were perhaps a bit disappointed. But on the whole, I think it was the atmosphere that people liked.
If the decision had been yours, would you have made the house over to the National Trust?
Probably, yes. I think if by any mischance it belonged to me now, the first thing I'd try to do would be to give it to the National Trust. There are disadvantages, but I think the National Trust is the best home for it.
And why do you say that?
They can look after it, whereas a private person can't. And they've got the experience of looking after houses. And they've got the staff to do it.
Would you like to see anything done differently? Any major changes made in the way that things are run?
Yes, I think one or two things are pity. The Manor Farm, just outside the gates here, used to be a working farm when we came here. It's a great pity it isn't now, but I think part of the trouble was that cows made such a mess in the streets and visitors complained. And yes.
Well, that's absurd, isn't it?
Well, it is absurd, but we've got to listen to what visitors say.
We've actually had them walk inside, you know, and when there had been approached, they say, well, what do you think you're doing? They just turn around and say, well, it's National Trust property, we're members. I always look at it like this, in fact, that when we go away, and we're tourists as well, and we do the same thing as what they do when they come here.
In many ways, Laycock is bound to be an artificial community, and its popularity certainly brings drawbacks for residents. But strict controls imposed by the National Trust do have their positive side. You won't wake up one morning to find the neighbours have put fake stone cladding on the other half of the house. The Trust has built up teams of craftsmen throughout the country who know how to maintain the properties and the landscape in which they're set. "5 miles of Hadrian's Wall, the most evocative symbol of the extent of the Roman conquest of Britain, is owned by the Trust and maintained by its craftsmen. The Trust's most important work in Cumbria is the conservation of more than a quarter of the Lake District National Park.
These stones are part of the very ancient
pass of the Stee, as it used to be called. And we feel that they are probably early medieval, may even be older. We know that in the 13th century this was already a well-used track. And it is this track that we found in 1979, hidden under the bracken, hidden under the grass, and found it simply by trying to find a solution to our 20th century erosion problems, and wondering if I could bring a zigzag path across here, that I saw I was standing on a shiny boulder. When I got down on my hands and knees to investigate why, this is what I found. It was under the turf, under the bracken. And this has now given us the clue, has given us the lead for all of the footpath work that we do. Wherever we have rock mountains, we've had to go back to the ancients to learn how to do aesthetically the work of erosion control in the late 20th century.
As a charity, the National Trust relies on volunteer labour not only to work in houses and shops, but to complete many of its national projects. Even Sir Anthony Hopkins finds time for a rather wet holiday project, rebuilding dry stone walls in his beloved Snowdonia.
It's amazing to think that these were actually built by farmers dead generations ago.
But then, until fairly recently, I suppose their descendants would have been working locally, working possibly in the same farms, doing much the same jobs that their forebears had done.
Dead easy.
Really just dead leaves.
There are hundreds of voluntary projects like this one, but you can't guarantee a star will be there on the one you choose.
In bloom are quite toxic and ruin the soil around it. Other wildlife, other vegetation is dying, insect life begins to dwindle, and bird life dwindles. And it's a vicious chain reaction. These are pretty vicious as well.
The coast just east of Foy in South Cornwall is one of the National Trust's greatest successes. For 30 years, Michael Trinick was responsible for Devon and Cornwall, and in that time earned the nickname King Neptune because of his work for the Coastline Appeal.
When I started with the National Trust down here, it had about 10 miles of coast, 3 major headlands really. And when I finished, it had just over 100 miles, so I was lucky enough to have that length of coast. But I don't count length of coast as the key thing. It's quality, it's what you're able to do when you've got it. Once you do own land, you can slowly, and one hopes reasonably imperceptibly, make it look much better to the eye, to the walker, to anyone who comes here, the people who just come to bathe. They suddenly realize it isn't only a nice bathing beach, it's something much more than that.
The National Trust is not opposed to the public having fun on their hard-won coastline. Studland Beach near Swanage in Dorset is undeniably and justifiably popular.
We get lost children, quite a few lost children in the summer, which we have to go and find, and as you can see, litter, of it. It's a job that has to be done, somebody's got to do it. So, it's just rubbish to me. 3-4-year-old girl locked herself in the toilet, so I had to go in and reach over the top with a brush and undo the lock to let her out. People injured themselves, cut themselves, then we have to do a bit of first aid and bandages, plasters, whatever, you know, to keep them happy.
People's image of a National Trust catering establishment is the little tea rooms on the side of a stately home run by volunteers. So they're very surprised when they see us down here with 300-yard queues and ice cream and beef burgers.
But Studland is more than a seaside resort. It's also a unique and fragile wildlife habitat. Dunes lead to untouched lowland heather, where rare wild flowers and all 6 species of British reptile can be found. Finding the right balance between conservation and public access is another part of Jeff Hand's work as countryside manager. It's a job that requires tact and understanding in dealing with visitors.
Hello, good afternoon. How do you do? I don't know if you've realised that we've had to strayed into one of the conservation areas that we got marked off here.
Oh, well, are there any signs here to say this?
There are down on that says Dune Restoration Area. There's one down across the front there, and there's another one in behind us here.
Oh, right.
Which way did you come in?
Well, we came in through that way.
Was there any fence there where you come
No,
through?
we walked straight through.
Oh dear,
where
somebody's
the huts were
broke the
down
fence
there.
again. Because what we're trying to do, we're trying to keep some of these areas actually
Yeah.
to the grass to grow again, otherwise we lose the whole
Yes, I
lot.
can
And once
quite
the wind
understand
gets
that.
in, it blows away. Anyway, thanks very much.
Not at all. We'll make sure we're not here tomorrow.
Brilliant.
Thank
Bye-bye
you.
then.
Bye-bye.
The main pressure on Studland Beach are people. It's the people that are coming here. We get very little damage as far as the sea is concerned. We get the odd problem, but like on the dune system, it's the pressures of people's feet on the actual vegetation that cause the problem.
On the dunes at Blakeney Point, plants have adapted to the harsh conditions, frequently battered by salt water and winds. Humans have presented the greater challenge, and now the Trust in North Norfolk is pioneering this wooden walkway in an attempt to stem the erosion. The generosity of its donors is the lifeblood of the National Trust. This piece of cliff-top land has been acquired as the result of an important bequest by Grace Peacock in memory of her sister.
Well, this is it. Here we are. We've come on a rather bumpy journey up a farm lane, and here we are at the piece of cliff land that you are very kindly going to donate. How do you like it?
Oh, I think it's absolutely marvellous. I've never seen anything like it. It's really beautiful, isn't it? The lovely coastline and the whole of it is all lovely. I've always wanted to do something like this, and now we can.
And as you know, this strip of coastline is a most important link in our puzzle.
Yes,
We've
so
been
you
gradually
say.
acquiring pieces of the coastline along here, and this has been literally the missing link.
Well-
So we're absolutely delighted that we're going to be able to now acquire it.
What I really wanted to do was find something that would be everlasting, because this piece particularly was never going to have a road through it, is it?
No.
So it will never be touched, never be spoilt, and there it is for everybody to enjoy, and I think that's the best of it. So
That's marvellous, and you
yes.
can't get a more fitting memorial than
No,
a
I
piece
don't
of
think.
countryside that is
No.
going to be there forever.
No, well that's it, and there might be a bit more later on.
Wonderful.
Let's see what we can do.
Soon after I was able to start work down here, I met Leslie Hicks with his hook, cutting a footpath for the parish council, and we talked. And over the years, we got to know each other rather well. So well, I think sometimes we know what the other's thinking. I could see the point of him, and that he was born in this parish, loves it dearly. And I, who wasn't born in this parish, but am a Cornishman, also love it dearly. And because of that, we wanted to make it as good as it could be. I hope it's not too bad.
there's nowhere like this in the rest of the world. This part of Cornwall is it's the old thing, the best thing that ever you could come across. If you stand out on the headland of a nice day like this, and peace, quiet, and this beauty, what we've got here, I think you could feel the richest person in the world. I do, and I'm sure other people must do the same. You needn't have a penny in the bank, but you could still feel that you're the richest person in the world. The money don't come in it. Nobody can buy this beauty that we got here.
Of course, protecting much-loved countryside is only part of the task. But wherever you look within the National Trust, you'll find that same love, that devotion to the job, and the passion to conserve. Nowadays, the word conservation has to some extent been hijacked by the Green Movement and is understood only to mean the protection of our natural heritage. But the men and women of the National Trust, the craftsmen and volunteers, the cleaners and clerks and managers and masons, remind us that conservation means the protection of all that is best in our national heritage. We have entrusted them with that great task, and they have not failed us.